About 10 years ago, I saw Ken Robinson's TED Talk, Do Schools Kill Creativity? It's a must-see. If you haven't watched it, I really recommend it. It changed the way I've taught, changed my way of thinking about teaching. Ken Robinson raises a question in this talk, which is the most watched TED Talk of all time. He gives us a challenge. How do we bring creativity into schools? But he doesn't really provide the solution. My career since then has been an attempt to try to figure out how do we live up to his challenge and bring creativity into social studies. I think I've figured out an answer, but it's been a long and pretty unexpected journey to do so. I started out my career over a decade teaching in New York City public schools, where I taught pretty much all types of students that New York City has to offer. I then moved to the suburbs a few years ago to a wealthy, affluent district north of the city, where I teach a very, very privileged group of students. I've learned that there's basically only one thing that ties together all these groups of students I've taught, and that is the need to rethink assessment and think about ways in which we can use assessment to help us fulfill our number one goal, providing the richest and deepest possible learning experience at all times for our students. Now, I've spent a lot of time in the past few years thinking, writing, talking about assessment. I just published a book in March. You may have missed news about it. Some other things were happening in March this year. But even though I spent all this time writing about assessment while working on that book, I actually think that we need to move beyond our obsession with this idea of evaluating students and what they've learned in the past, which seems to be the core of assessment. We need to start thinking about assessment as another opportunity, perhaps the deepest opportunity we have for making meaning for students, for building creativity, and for bringing joy to the learning experience. Assessment, because of the amount of time we can spend on it, is the number one meaning-making opportunity that we have for our children. Now, when we normally think about assessment in social studies, traditionally we're talking about two different types of things, tests and writing. And when we think about authentic assessment, then we're really talking generally about writing, about formal writing and research papers, okay? And those have a really important place in history, a really important place in social studies, and they're not things that we should ignore. Now, there are ways to make writing more or less authentic, formal writing, but I want to actually move our conversation away from that, okay? We know those are important parts of the discipline. What I'm arguing for, what I found that works for the most struggling students in New York City and those high flyers in wealthy suburbs, is bringing creativity into assessment, is what I call historical art. Okay. Now, I'm not saying historical art should completely replace tests and writing, of course. Okay. I'm arguing for a third test in a particular marking period or year, if we think about the whole year, a third for tests and quizzes, a third for writing, formal writing, and a third for these creative historical art pieces. Okay, now I'm actually a really unlikely cheerleader for this. Traditionally, I thought of myself as an academic person without basically any skills in art whatsoever. My family asked me to not sing at the Passover Seder, to try to lip sync. When I created artwork as a high schooler, friends of my father thought they had that we had the new baby in the family when they looked at my art on the mantelpiece. So this is an area where I actually have no background, okay? I just have appreciation. But I've learned to draw on that appreciation to build my skills as a teacher and to bring that out for my students. And since then, I've discovered, and this is one of the really interesting processes of all this, that I actually have some talents in other forms of art, like poetry, that I had historical fiction that I had never really considered before. Okay? But what I do know is that all students can produce historical art. Okay? Actually, the kids who we most normally think of as academically the strongest, interestingly, sometimes often provide still the best historical art. Okay, especially when you add creative writing in there, which tells us that art actually requires a lot of intellectual thinking. If we're seeing the strongest traditionally academic students also producing the strongest historical art, whether it's poetry or painting or perspective pieces like diary entries or poetry, etc. But what you will also find is that once in a while you'll have a kid who really, really struggles in the traditional academic formal writing, and one or two kids a semester are just going to blow you away in the way they're able to show their knowledge and understanding and arguments through artwork. And what you've done then is you've changed that kid's life. You've changed their experience. And this is what we need to do as teachers. Okay? Art is actually authentic to the field of history as a form of production, which we don't normally recognize. And historians are producing their work in all kinds of different formats. So my friend, Professor Trevor Getz, who's a professor at San Francisco State University, he won an award from the American Historical Association for his book, Abbott and the Important Men. What made this book so special? It's deep scholarship, but it's produced as graphic history. Okay, it's a comic book essentially, but with deep historical scholarship intertwined with the comic art features. Okay, Laurent Dubois, the esteemed historian of Haiti, has also produced a graphic history available for free online of the Haitian Revolution. Eric Foner is involved, obviously, all the time in panel discussions, podcasts, things of that sort. Speaking of podcasts, you have historians like Joanne Freeman of Yale, of 18th century American history, who's on the podcast Backstory, along with some other great historians. So you have all of these different formats that historians are actually using. Art has always been fundamental to how we learn and understand history, and artists have always been producing historical arguments, whether or not they're historians. Okay, so if you think, how do we learn about the Holocaust, for example? Of course, there's great traditional historical scholarship. Lucy Davidovitz's The War Against the Jews. You have Police Battalion 101, which looks at these amazing choices that ordinary Germans had to take in whether or not to massacre Jews in this Police Battalion 101 by Christopher Browning. But we normally first start learning about the Holocaust through arguments made in historical fiction like The Devil's Arithmetic, in movies, Schindler's List, for example, or The Pianist. You go to the Holocaust Memorial Museum in Washington, D.C., right? Which is a visceral artistic experience of understanding and empathizing with the Holocaust. You have paintings like Jan Kamsky from Survivors. You have poetry from people like Martin Niemöller. You have, of course, as well, you have music and all different forms of art, theater, right? Let's take another example. Really famous one. Just got streamed on Disney Plus, so I finally got to see it because I couldn't afford the tickets previously. Hamilton, course, on Broadway. Lin-Manuel Miranda is this famous depiction of Hamilton, which is now controlling the historical discussion about Alexander Hamilton himself, right? Previously, of course, there's been centuries of historical scholarship about Alexander Hamilton. There was a book by a popular historian, Ron Chernow, but it's really Manuel Miranda that's going to inform the next decades of conversation about Hamilton among the public in terms of historical memory, who lives, who dies, who tells our story, right? In terms of how prominent slavery plays into the debate or not. Okay. Now, historians are actually recognizing this is true historical scholarship. That's why the American Historical Review, the most important journal of history here in the United States, is now over the past few years reviewing wider variety of historical forms. Okay, they are reviewing in the journal, you can find it, graphic histories, historical fiction, museums, monuments, even podcasts, role plays, all of those are being reviewed. So adults who have far less need for play than kids are getting to have a whole lot of fun in their production of historical arguments and their demonstration of historical knowledge and understanding. But for some reason, then kids, were just not giving them that opportunity. And that's what we need to rethink seriously. There's educational scholarship that points to this as well, okay? So it's not just the American Historical Review who's saying this is real stuff. You have Jalmed and Sarah Fine produced this wonderful book in the past year where they argue that, okay, it's not actually school that's such a drag like we normally think it is. And now we know, right? School is actually much better than we all thought it was. It's the core academic classes that are really a problem. They argue that there's amazing, vibrant, dynamic, joyful, fun learning happening in periphery courses, in electives, in clubs, in sports, in theater. That's where the learning is happening that are keeping kids engaged and making meaning in the work. It's not happening enough in the core classes. I think that's a really important argument. I think history teachers actually make a lot of really fun, exciting lessons, but then sometimes we tend to throw it away when we get to the assessments, right? That opportunity for joy and excitement. All right. Now, how do you do this? You do this through having really clear, detailed rubrics and assignments that make students understand you can't just tell the story. You need to have an argument. You need to have a thesis and evidence in your artwork. Some of that's going to happen symbolically. You also show them models. You show them things like Jose Clemente Orozco's painting Cortez and the Cross, right? Where he makes an argument about Cortez as a conquistador, as a villain through his artwork. You maybe show them Alvin Ailey's Dance, a tribute to civil rights on YouTube. How are they making a historical argument about the civil rights through dance? You could show them a poem by Maya Angelou, Our Grandmothers, right? Making an argument about slavery. And discrimination through poetry. So you have the rubrics, you give them a variety of different models that you analyze, and students, they can produce diary entries or perspective pieces or letters where they write from the perspectives of ordinary people. They could do a perspective piece on the same event from a British colonial officer and a Ghanaian servant. They can write poetry, also actually from multiple voices I've had students do. They can do a painting. Students can produce paintings of choices in the Holocaust using abstract symbolism, like the student who used rose petals and 4 different panels to describe different types of choices people made. Students create memorials, even using Minecraft over distance learning. And they can do these amazing panel podcast discussions using digital technology, especially in distance learning, which has been so powerful, where they have these historical conversations with each other over Zoom, for example. They record them. They work together to make meaning out of what they're learning. They have this joyful experience talking to each other, and then they produce something that's recognizable history for those who listen to podcasts or watch YouTube panel discussions among historians, but it's also allowed for collaboration, right? Now, I wrote this book and I made this argument before COVID, before the pandemic, before distance learning. And I was making the argument that this rethinking of assessment, so it's not just about evaluation, it's about meaning making and joy and really positive, inspiring educational experiences, that's important at all times. Now we're in a really new situation. We're in a time of incredible tragedy, of tension, of fear, of heartache, of despair. We don't know what the fall's going to look like, but we know our kids need joy. They need opportunities to create. They need opportunities to express themselves. They're not all taking art classes, right? This work of turning assessments and thereby school and social studies into a powerful, meaning-making, joyful, creative experience, it's always important. But now, there's nothing more important that we can do for our students than this. Thank you.